for men who've been through a high stress, or maybe who have highly stressful jobs, if you suspect that the cortisol levels are high, your body will go into protection mode, and essentially it drops the metabolic rate. So even though you might
downregulates,
so you might be calorie restricting, but actually you're burning fewer calories because your body's trying to preserve it because it thinks you might not survive.
Yes.
And that's something that I see a lot. And there's also, of course, a gene behind that.
Okay.
So there's a specific gene called the FTO gene. It's colloquially called the fat gene. And this is one of the ones where I alluded to earlier, how changes in the genetic code do happen generationally. So they've found...
Have you ever wondered why some people seem to lose weight a lot faster than others? Some people can eat croissants till their heart is content, and yet they don't seem to put an ounce of fat, whereas you just look at a croissant and you put on 2 kgs. Have you ever wondered why some people have worse hangovers compared to others? Perhaps you can't have a cup of coffee after 3 o'clock in the afternoon because you'll sit in bed into the early hours of the morning wide awake, where other people can have a coffee after dinner and can go to sleep and rest and sleep like a baby. The answer might be in your DNA, and this is where co-founder of DNApal, Kate Scott, can help you with the questions that you might have about your body and give you some explanations as to how best to plan your lifestyle going forward. This is a wonderful episode that might answer all your questions, and this is very crucial. At DNApal, with the work that they do, not only can you provide for a more sustainable solution in the future, but you can now begin to understand your past. I really hope you like this episode. Please like, share, subscribe, and enjoy. Kate Scott, welcome to the Expect Performance podcast.
Thanks, Clint. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure. So, Kate, you're the co-founder of a company called DNApal. Can you give me some of your background and then how the company started and what you guys do?
Sure. It's been quite a journey, actually. It all started while I was studying nutrition and biomedicine in London. Quite a long time ago now, probably 2012 is when I started. And one of the modules that we had in our final year was on a branch of science called nutrigenomics, which I'd never heard of at the time. It was a fairly young science, probably only about 20 years old now. It's just fascinating. It looks at the two-way interaction between how our genes respond to nutrients. So everything that we eat, good or bad, essentially works as sort of a code in the body and provides nourishment in different ways. So looking at how genes respond to that on the one hand, and also how your fixed genetic code kind of implies an increased need, or maybe that you might be intolerant to certain foods depending on what kind of variation of the code you've inherited. And my mind was just blown. It was a real light bulb moment for me, because after 3 years of studying nutrition, where you'd see in clinical practice that some people do so well on a specific type of diet and it just doesn't have the same results for someone else.
Yeah, it's a story of my life as a fitness professional.
So same goes for exercise. Certain types of training works really well for some people, but then not for others. And so that's where the light bulb really switched on for me. It's like, this is why we are all slightly biochemically different in terms of, so essentially it's like understanding your DNA is like having your source code. Everything that happens in your body, so every single protein, hormone, every single thing that's built and made is under regulation by your genes. Everything. And so knowing whether, or having the map to understanding that particular gene for you works too slowly, or that particular gene works too quickly. And those really are the only two options. They either overproduce the message or the protein that they're trying to make, or they underproduce it, and that depends on your code. And that has knock-on effects on your biochemistry. So that sounds really sciencey, but in practicality, that can be things like we were talking about earlier, the caffeine sensitivity.
Yes.
That's purely just a detoxification enzyme that's under regulation of a specific gene called CYP1A2. And if it works slowly, you process caffeine, so you detoxify caffeine slower, which means it hangs around in your system for longer. And so you have the sort of psychoactive effects. It's much stronger for you.
So and then like in a daily practice, that person wouldn't have coffee later in the day versus somebody who could maybe have a coffee in the afternoon.
And depending on how severe it is. So you have 2 copies of every gene. So you inherit one from your mother, one from your father. And depending on whether you have, let's call it the slow metabolizer variant, you might inherit that from one parent, or you might actually inherit that from both parents, in which case you'd be a really slow metabolizer.
Okay.
So in that case, those people, so the super slow metabolizers, actually really find that it's better if they completely avoid caffeine because of the negative effects. So the knock-on effects really are things like anxiety, jitters, obviously it impacts sleep, getting that tired but wired feeling, and nobody wants that. Actually, when you're having coffee, aside from if you just really like the taste, what you're wanting is the alertness.
Yes.
You just want to, you want to feel good, you want to feel on top of your game, and if it's actually having the opposite effect, why are you doing it?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so then fast forward, what happened next after varsity?
So light bulb moment, I actually went off and did my own DNA test. So at the time, the only company I knew of was a big American DNA testing company called 23andMe. I don't think it operates in Africa, but most people have heard of it. It's kind of globally known. Sent my swab off, got the results back, and they do partially ancestry. So that is obviously one major thing you can see from your DNA code, is also all about your heritage. And then heaps of information about what is called phenotypes. So essentially it means you've inherited this variation of a gene, which means X. So like we've just used the caffeine example, you've got the slow metabolizer, it means you're a slow caffeine metabolizer. What was missing there for me was so now what?
Yes.
So what do I do? So that got me thinking, I really need to start understanding the science behind this more. So I really went down the rabbit hole for the next 5 years, deeply researching all the nutrigenetic papers that were available, trying to understand, which genes had been sufficiently researched so that you could definitively say, if you have this variation, this is what it means for you, and this is what you can do about it. And at the time, as I said, it's a fairly young science. There wasn't really that much research available. So in some cases, we'd have to extrapolate or look at, logically, if we know that this gene is not functioning really well and it requires these types of vitamins and minerals as cofactors, for example, let's see what happens when we put them in. So guinea pigging myself as well, a little bit. I put together my first kind of holistic health DNA report. So pulling out the top genes that have been the most well-researched kind of across populations and with big sample numbers. And just started to sell those reports to other practitioners interested in the space, not having the expertise, but wanting to be able to look at that level of detail in their clients to be able to offer more personalized recommendations. Then what I realized was missing is, and I think we're going to talk about this coming up, but your genes don't operate in isolation. You also need to be looking at what's happening with that individual. So what is the environment that they're in? What kind of diet do they follow? Are they exercising? Are they under extreme stress? all those kind of things, what's happening with their gut health. And so that led me to develop an algorithm. So we decided to develop a mobile app, which is a whole nother segue, but we decided to develop a mobile app, and within that is the algorithm that essentially asks the user a set of questions, so a set of lifestyle, environment, mental health questions, and then pulls in the DNA data, puts those two data sets together to provide ongoing advice and support and recommendations.
That's very cool.
And there is no other company, even companies in the kind of personalized nutrition space, who put those two data sets together to provide the ongoing support. Because recommendations that I might give you today, so if you did a DNA test with us and you told me a bit about your lifestyle and what your needs are currently, the kind of diet that you're eating, I might give you a plan today based on that. But in 5 years' time, you might come back to me and your circumstances have changed. Mm-hmm. Your body's changed. Your testosterone might be dropping slightly because you're getting slightly older. The most marked differences, obviously, that we see are in women, in females.
Yes.
Because they have such different life stages. So that's where, as two female founders as well, it's something that we've experienced, we've been through. So I would say that female hormones is a particular niche for us. But I like all hormones. I like kind of looking, stress, how that's impacting people's lives and biochemistry, and then looking at how their genes also might be working for them or against them.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that the concept of the ongoing support, because like you say, life is fluid. It changes all the time.
Yeah.
Different things come into your life. You have kids, maybe not as much sleep as I'm used to getting. That's going to affect my hormones, etc. So for me, one thing that I've noticed since Grayson's come on board is I have a tendency to crave more sugary, unhealthy foods. And I'm pretty sure that it's because I'm not getting as good quality sleep.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've never been like a big snacker where it doesn't bother me at all if there's no Chockies or Lay's chips in the fridge or whatever. But I've noticed the last couple of months, I really like having a box of Romany creams in the cupboard now, just as a fail-safe and that type of thing. And that's totally not me. And that's the only thing that I think I can put my finger on that might have changed.
Yeah, classic picture. So what happens is your sleep quality and probably quantity are tanking or are less than they were previously. Your cortisol levels go up. It automatically starts messing with your insulin. It messes with the way that your body regulates and stores glucose, and starts to make you want to crave either sugary or salty snacks.
Yeah.
To fill that void.
To fill the gap.
Yeah. It starts also messing with the hormones, so leptin and ghrelin, which work against each other. So you start to get higher ghrelin levels. So your hunger, you just constantly feel hungry. That is actually, as I said, everything is under genetic control, but one of the genes that we report on is actually the leptin receptor.
Okay.
So that's the receptor in the brain that when you're eating, as your stomach fills up, it sends a leptin signal to the brain to say, okay, you've had enough, stop eating.
We full now. Mm-hmm.
So some people inherit a variant of that gene where the receptor's a little bit deaf. Mm-hmm. And so they still get the signal, the leptin is still released, but the receptor doesn't really get the memo until maybe 10, 20, 30 minutes later. And you see that manifest. So this is where I was saying earlier, the phenotype. So the phenotype of that would look like somebody either who overeats, so they always dish themselves a really big plate of food and then mow that down and then feel really, really, really full. Or it's somebody who eats and then 10 minutes later they need a snacky, and then another half an hour later they need another snacky. So there are interventions that we put in place, because obviously if that's genetically driven, in order to get that satiety, because that's what's lacking, it's that feeling of satiety. So that's looking at when you are snacking, instead of reaching for the Romany creams, you need to be looking at more kind of protein and good fat-rich snacks so that they fill that gap, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so then let me play devil's advocate. So we're talking about genes and the impact that it has on so many things. I mean, I've seen things on your website when there's genes that for motivation, for metabolizing of caffeine, for sleep, for exercise. I mean, the list goes on and on. But woe is me, the reason that I am who I am, let's say I'm an overweight male, and my genes are the reason why I'm craving these foods. And my mom and dad were overweight, and their parents were overweight. And the reason I'm overweight is because it's hereditary and I've just got bad genes. There's nothing I can do about it. I just have to accept it. And I'm going to live my best life and enjoy being fat. Okay? Is that something that we can change? Can we make changes to our lifestyle and affect and modify our genetic makeup through the lifestyle decisions that we make?
Yes. So, and that's actually why we as DNApal exist. Because if it was just to say, this is your genotype, this is your phenotype, so these are your genes, this is what it means, too bad, what's the point?
Yes.
So there's a layer that exists on top of your genes. So your genes are a fixed code. They don't change within your lifetime. There are changes that happen to the genetic code that happen over generations, but it's a much slower thing. It's usually in response to environmental need that you'll see that happen within populations. But epigenetically, so everything that sits on top of the genes, and that is what we've spoken about, your environment, even down to your thoughts. And there is research, there's real research on this. They influence the way that your genes express. So it's gene expression and epigenetics that we aim to try to improve by understanding the person's hard code. So it's not, and bear in mind, because this nature versus nurture argument is, age old.
Yes.
And while, let's say, science can't put an exact percentage on how, what percent do genes affect the outcome versus lifestyle, because I think it's variable. They do know that genes have a big impact, but actually the environment and lifestyle play just as big a role.
Yes.
And there's lots of research coming out about that. There are also two things that get passed down generationally. So even when people think, oh, well, those are just my genes, there's nothing I can do about it. Bear in mind that thought patterns and habits and dietary choices can also be passed down in families. So sometimes it's not even necessarily that it's in the genes. It could also just be something that's learned behavior that comes down from parents.
What about the person that is doing the healthy living, that is making the healthy decisions, they're staying active? I've got a client of mine who's like this. He's 124 kgs, middle-aged male, and he is by 50 kgs the smallest in his family. Okay? So there's a pattern there. And I'm almost certain, 95% confident that he's in a calorie deficit more often than not, which should see weight loss. And yet it's not happening. His body composition's changing, so his protein his muscle percentage has gone up and his body fat percentage has come down, but the weight has not moved at all. So is that, what would you say about a person like that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of reasons for that. So number one, there are a few genes that I would like to look at sitting kind of underneath it all. So I always call genetic testing is like the cornerstone. You want to look at what is happening with people at their baseline, and the genes are the baseline. And then we start building up on top of that. And that's where there's loads of other functional tests that can come into play to, tick a box of where the issues might lie. But that, for me, there's a couple of reasons why people who are in calorie deficit fail to lose weight or struggle to lose weight. And it also depends, I mean, you're saying you can obviously see him, but it also depends if it's something on the scale. So the one thing could be that actually he's building muscle. We know that muscle weighs more than fat. Muscle is more metabolically active, so it's going to start burning fat. So if that's the reason, that means he's on a good path. You know, you want the number on the scale to maybe not be going down if you're building muscle. But I would want to look at hormonal. So you want to be looking at what's going on with cortisol. Is there a lot of stress? Thyroid?
Fine.
Okay.
It's done all of those tests.
So, but I'd also be interested because I see a lot of people who come back with fine thyroid labs. If they're just testing for FSH alone, it's not enough. You know, there are actually a lot of markers that can impact. They need to be looking at T3, T4, and something called reverse T3, and also antibodies. So it's something that could be autoimmune. But okay, let's say, because I do see thyroid issues, I tend to see more in women. Not that it doesn't happen in men, but much more common. Inflammation and toxic load could be another reason. All your body does is try to protect you, really, and keep you alive. So if historically, I don't know what his diet and lifestyle were like, but your body holds toxins in your body fat. So it might be that his body's holding on to the body fat because it's toxic. So things that you can try in that case are things like steam and sauna, trying to detox that way, increasing hydration, so making sure that you're flushing through the kidneys and the liver. What else is there? Oh, the other thing, and again, I see this more in females, but also potentially in men, is sometimes when people go into calorie deficit, it can make the body almost go into protective mode because now it thinks we're starving.
Yes, when's the next meal coming?
Yes. And so I know it's a big thing. Everybody's intermittent fasting these days. It's actually one of the questions I get asked probably the most. Particularly for perimenopausal and menopausal women, I say don't touch it.
Okay.
But I'd say for people, for men who've been through a high stress or maybe who have highly stressful jobs, if you suspect that the cortisol levels are high, your body will go into protection mode, and essentially it drops the metabolic rate. So even though you might
downregulates,
so you might be calorie restricting, but actually you're burning fewer calories because your body's trying to preserve it because it thinks you might not survive.
Yes.
And that's something that I see a lot. And there's also, of course, a gene behind that.
Okay.
So there's a specific gene called the FTO gene. It's colloquially called the fat gene. And this is one of the ones where I alluded to earlier how changes in the genetic code do happen generationally. So they've found that for populations who lived through wars and famine, there was a variation of this gene that occurred that drops the metabolic rate because it's trying to conserve energy. It's got a twofold action or a two-part action. So number one, metabolic rate is lower. Number two, it actually makes you crave higher calorie foods.
As a survival mechanism.
As a survival mechanism.
Wow.
Exactly. So again, phenotypically, what that looks like in people is higher body fat percentage, just higher body fat, even though they might eat really well and they might exercise, they still don't have that lean body mass. I'm one of them. So it's called the fat gene. And remember I said how you inherit, you've got two copies, so you inherit two copies. So if you inherit one from either of your parents, I call that the half fat gene. If you inherit both variations, I call that the full fat gene. I have the half fat gene, and I know I'm one of those people. If I even look at a croissant on the table, whereas I have other friends, skinny friends, they can have 4 of them.
Don't sound so resentful.
It's a bone of contention, but I know it. And actually, the research behind it shows that the best way to combat that FTO gene or the variant is by building muscle. So not heaps of cardio, actually, good kind of weight-bearing exercise.
Yeah. Because then, like you say, if you've got more muscle, you're more metabolically active, which means you're going to burn more calories naturally.
And I can see that. If you've got your step counter on your phone, I can go mad. I can put my steps right up and make sure that I'm walking, the 10,000 steps a day or even exceeding that. And it doesn't really move the needle. And I'm not saying, I actually think walking is one of the best forms of exercise for longevity. But if we're talking weight loss, and I don't think the goal is necessarily to be skinny. Skinny does not always equal healthy. But we all want to have that sort of lean muscle look. Definitely. I think men and women. So I find if I switch my exercise up to things like Pilates, which I've started doing now, I can notice a difference within 1 or 2 weeks already.
Really, hey?
Yeah.
Okay, just that little bit of resistance makes a difference.
Yeah, so I don't know what kind of training you're doing with that particular client.
We do a lot of weight training.
Okay.
That's why his muscle mass has increased.
Yeah.
And he's got very strong. So all the markers, as far as that's concerned, has gone up.
Yeah.
So, but it's just, everything you read, there's two things really. Intermittent fasting is big. And then the other thing is calorie deficit this, calorie deficit that.
Yeah.
And like you say, in some instances it works really well for people, and it is that simple. Make sure that you burn more calories than you're taking in, and things are going to sort themselves out.
Yeah.
But other times it's not that simple. Somebody that doesn't sleep very well, their anabolic hormones that are going to be responsible for muscle recovery, etc., spike at certain times of your sleep. And if you're not getting into the different sleep phases, that's going to affect them. Cortisol is going to go up. All of these other things that we don't really consider.
Exactly. Until you have a trickier case, or until you have someone who doesn't fit, the usual program.
Yes.
Yeah, which is where the original light bulb moment came in, because there are people that don't respond to the typically, healthy diet or the typical fitness regime.
Yeah.
And then you have to start digging deeper. Things like inflammation, toxic load. If he's looked at hormones, if he's done sort of hormone panels, the other thing to think about is fat tissue, adipose tissue, actually creates its own aromatase enzyme. That's just a fancy word that means creates its own estrogen.
Okay.
So obviously, again, in men, that's true of men and women, but that could be something that's blocking weight loss for him. He might be a bit more estrogenic, but as he starts to lose that adipose tissue, that should improve.
Sure.
Yeah.
Very interesting, hey? There's so many other things, Jeanette. I was on your website and reading through the articles and that you and your business partner have written. And it's quite mind-blowing, really, the things that have come up. Like in genetics, your genes can affect your levels of motivation. So now that's, okay, we can wrap our heads around the weight loss thing and the sleep and even the metabolizing of caffeine. But motivation, like mental aspects as well, that are completely, you would almost say that they're like subjective, Like how do you put the science behind motivation? It's kind of like it's something that you grapple with. How do you define it, and how does one stay motivated? But now there's a genetic expression of that.
And I even see that in personality traits. So, it's a total nerd joke to me, but one of the genes that affects motivation, among other things, is called the COMT gene, so COMT, and its main role is to break down and metabolize dopamine, adrenaline, so it's involved in stress regulation, and estrogen. Those are the three main metabolites that go through that pathway. The major cofactor required for that enzyme to work, so assuming, depending on what version of the gene you already inherit. So there's one version you can inherit that is slow, which means you metabolize those substrates slowly. There's kind of the Goldilocks in the middle, which I usually say actually you want the mixed bag, or there's a very fast version as well of that gene. So you can see, depending on the substrate that it's metabolizing, it kind of has different effects.
Yeah.
So the adrenaline, when you're under, that kind of immediate stress that puts you into fight or flight response, if you're breaking that down very slowly, you're going to be a person who feels the after effects of stress badly, which means that you're likely to be more of an overreactor, maybe shy away from stressful situations, not like confrontation. So you can see how it goes from being something quite physical into actually manifesting in personality traits.
Yes, yeah.
So same goes for dopamine, which is a big neurotransmitter that's behind motivation. That's why I say that the middle version of that gene is actually sort of where you want to be, because you don't want to break down dopamine really quickly. You don't want to have the fast version of that gene. It could be good from an estrogen perspective, again, depending on the individual. So dopamine genes definitely affect the motivation. There's another gene called BDNF. So in our mobile app, under the fitness section, we actually look specifically at BDNF in terms of motivation to exercise. And it really depends what variation of that gene you inherit, whether you're somebody who jumps out of bed excited to go and train, or whether it's like I've got to do this because I don't want to be fat.
I'm the second one, for sure.
Okay,
that's
interesting.
I don't find training fun at all.
I would not have thought that.
No, I do it with long teeth, for sure.
Okay.
But the discomfort of the exercise is, I would rather have that discomfort. I always say you get to choose. You don't get to choose whether or not you're going to experience discomfort, but you do get to choose what type of discomfort you want.
Absolutely.
So mine is like, okay, well, I'd rather have the discomfort of working out as opposed to the discomfort of not feeling good afterwards, as opposed to not feeling my best, not looking my best. So it's always that like devil on the one shoulder and then the logical one on the other shoulder. Yeah. But and that's why I understand why people come here, because I understand if you don't want to exercise, why would you?
Yeah,
It's
accountability.
yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, I think if you're paying for it and somebody is expecting you to show up, so if you're a person who's not naturally motivated,
yes.
And I would say I'm probably not either. I think once you get into the rhythm of it and you start to see progress, and now you're putting on clothes and they actually feel comfortable.
Yes.
And they go from feeling comfortable to actually looking quite good. That becomes quite motivating in itself.
Absolutely. So action breeds motivation, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And then similarly, so for me, if I had to go and see a trainer, I would be a trainer's dream, because I also really don't like letting people down. So I would never miss a session.
Same.
Because I'd feel too bad. So like I would be there every time. I wouldn't miss a session. And then, so yeah, it's interesting how that works.
Yeah.
But so you've been with DNApal. It was founded when? How many years ago?
So technically 2017.
Okay.
Yeah, we've been going for a long time. We launched. Trying to think. We launched in 2017. In 2019, we did a crowdfunding raise. To raise the funding to actually build the app. This is, I alluded to earlier that sure, the app is a whole nother tangent, because we're both, me and my co-founder are both nutritional therapists. Our passion is understanding the biochemistry, building the algorithm, helping people use that knowledge to become healthier and happier and live longer.
Yes.
Neither of us knew anything about tech. And we said to each other, how hard can it be? Well,
famous last words.
Let me tell you, to anybody who's thinking about developing a mobile app, it is hard and it is expensive.
Yeah.
So we did a crowdfunding round at the end of 2019 going into 2020. And I don't know if you know anything about crowdfunding, but it's essentially it goes out onto a platform and people can bid to buy a share of your company. And it can be anything from kind of a tenner to a big chunk, but obviously the stake that they get is proportional to what they put in. But you have to say how much you want to raise, and if you raise R1 short of that, you don't get to keep any of the money.
What?
So you either have to hit your target or exceed it in order to keep the funding. So we were looking for quite a chunky amount in pounds. And actually, we were doing really well. We had exceeded our funding by about £15,000. We were feeling really good. We were virtually high-fiving each other because we don't live in the same place. And then COVID happened. So I think it was the last week of our campaign when the news hit and the lockdowns were going to start happening. And obviously people were not sure about what was going to happen with their jobs, their financial situations. So they started pulling their pledges back. And so then we ended up being probably about £15,000 short of our target. But luckily, we did end up finding one chunky investor who came and saved the day. And so with that budget, we developed kind of what's called the MVP of the app. In hindsight, and I know this isn't a startup podcast, but in hindsight, I wish we'd done a web-based app to begin with and done something much simpler. But here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah, here we are. And to our knowledge, we are the only company doing what we're doing in terms of the algorithm that we built that puts those two data sets together. And I find it helpful. You know, I can't remember all my genes all the time. I like having it in my pocket. I pull it out and I think, oh yes, that's why I'm reacting like this right now. And I put it back. Or sometimes, I don't know, it comes up in conversation. I mean, it didn't used to, but I think DNA testing is starting to become more understood and more accepted. When I first started it, people used to look at me with big eyes and say, but I don't want to learn how I'm going to die. And I'd say, you can't, I can't tell you that. Actually, there's nothing scary because we discussed epigenetically, in a way, there are certain markers that can lead to susceptibility to certain conditions. Especially type 2 diabetes is a big one, but also Alzheimer's is one of the genes we look at.
I wanted to ask you about mental illness as well.
Yeah. So it's about how you frame it. We don't say Alzheimer's. We're not qualified doctors, so we're actually, and also both of us believe that there's power in suggestion as well. So we try and keep it positive. What we focus on is the pathway in which that gene works, and then just giving people tools in order to improve that, to make sure that they're doing everything possible to make sure that they don't develop.
Yes. So did you ever watch Limitless, that series with Hemsworth?
Yes.
So he, I think, had that gene with the Alzheimer's from both his parents. That was a fascinating series, and how he went through each different experts to try and basically live longer.
Yeah.
So yes, I 100% agree with you. It's how you frame it.
Yeah.
And I think whether you like it or not, it's there.
That's it.
So rather the devil you know than the devil you don't, and bring it to light.
Empowered.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You have to. You have to. And when I spoke to somebody before you came on the show, I said, this is what we're going to chat about, and this is what Kate does, and it's really interesting, and blah-de-blah-de-blah. And they said, oh, wow, so I'm going to be able to see my future. So I said, yeah, maybe, but also importantly, you'll be able to understand your past. And you can think back and you can be like, oh, so that's why I always battled with that as a kid. That's why that person was always fine with this and I was never. Or that's why I could do this and that person couldn't. It starts to make sense. The puzzle pieces start to come together.
That's the number one comment that I get, is that it feels so affirming. And so people say, oh, okay, it kind of goes back to one of your earlier questions. Okay, so it's not my fault that this is like this because it's in my genes. No, it's not your fault. It's in your genes. But now you have the power to do something about it.
Yes, yes. And I think also once you've got that knowledge to say, okay, I accept the situation that this is going to be more difficult for me to do than another person, you can immediately get your head around what is required for you to make the changes that are necessary. And you almost have to then at the same time then accept, okay, for me, with this, my progress is going to be slower than somebody else. So it also immediately then reframes it and draws you back to running your own race, as opposed to comparing yourself to somebody on social media or a friend or a colleague, because it is completely different. Your race is completely different to mine. Mine is completely different to my peer, etc., etc.
And you know what? It might be there's one area where that person might be better than you, but they will have their own, everybody has a mixed bag of genes. They will have their own area somewhere else where they need to work harder. It just might not be one that you can see with your eye.
Yeah, exactly. So 2017, that's 7 years ago. You must have looked at tons and tons of reports and...
About 3,000.
Okay. So have you seen over those 3,000 reports any patterns or changes in people's, generally speaking, the population's genetic makeup? Because a lot's happened in the last, shall we say, 3 or 4 years to our bodies and the things we've had to expose ourselves to and been exposed to. Have you seen changes over that time?
Yeah, so not to the raw results, because the code doesn't change, but certainly the reasons that people come to do the testing have shifted, I'd say, in the last 3 or 4 years. The main concerns are stress-related, stress and sleep. I kind of put those in a similar camp. Hormone and immune dysregulation.
Okay.
I'd say those are the top ones that we deal with. In terms of across populations, though, that's an interesting question, because that is generally how, genes pass down within population groups. Obviously, as time goes on, we're starting to mix more and it becomes more integrated. But one of the major things, and one of the genes that came to mind when I was saying how the code remains static throughout your lifetime, but there are instances where generationally they can change in response to environment or, environmental input. And one of those is lactose intolerance, actually.
Yeah.
So humans are all born lactose intolerant, all of us.
What?
So
I didn't know that.
Hear me out. So we have the ability to digest lactase up until we wean, because there's lactase in breast milk. So after that point, you're not supposed to really drink the milk of another animal.
Yeah.
Or it wasn't common, let's say, until the advent of dairy. So farming and then dairy. So the population groups that have had that type of farming and then dairy in their diets for a couple of centuries now are able, so we have evolved, so mainly Caucasians, we have evolved to produce the enzyme lactase that breaks down lactose into adulthood. Which was
previously not the case?
Not the case.
Centuries ago?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
But so where I see lactose intolerance mainly are in African and Asian clients across the board.
Serious?
Yeah, so and there's certain other things. There's another gene to do with metabolizing alcohol, actually. Have you ever heard of the Asian flush?
No.
Okay, that's a thing. So obviously,
the Asian flush.
Yeah. Because it happens mainly in the Asian population. They have a high incidence of this particular enzyme that actually works really quickly. So that sounds counterintuitive, because you'd think you want to metabolize alcohol really quickly. However, because alcohol is a major toxin, the next metabolite is something called acetaldehyde, which is 100 times more toxic than alcohol. So actually, you don't want to metabolize alcohol quickly because you flood your system with a very, very potent toxin. And it makes, when you get bar rash.
Bar rash, yeah.
So the technical term is Asian flush. But yeah, so bar rash, sometimes nausea. Essentially that's why we eventually get the hangover.
Yeah.
It's from being poisoned. That's what we do to ourselves pretty much every weekend. But yeah, I see that a lot in Asian clients, and they just don't touch alcohol because it makes them feel so awful.
Okay, so you've sparked a question now. Are people genetically predisposed to bad hangovers then?
Definitely.
Because of their relationship in terms of metabolizing alcohol?
So there's obviously also just the physical aspect of it.
Yes.
Is, if you're going to be loading up your body.
Mm-hmm.
So
apart from the obvious drinking like a savage and like cleaning out the bar with I'll have whiskey, then I'll have beer, then I'll have shooters, then I'll have this. Taking all of that into consideration, level playing field. Are there people that genetically hang worse than others?
Definitely.
That's so interesting, eh? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. But Kate, it's been wonderful to have you on the show. I've learned a lot. I know this is going to be super useful for loads of people. But where can people find you if they want to get in touch with you, if they want to get on board with the app at DNApal, which I'd recommend that they do. But I'm going to attach all of this in the show notes. But where can people find you?
Great. So follow us. The best platform probably is Instagram. I think we're DNA.pal on Instagram. If people want to email me with questions and things like that, kate@dnapal.me, DNApal, like friend, PAL.me. What was the other question?
Website?
Yes, website, sure, DNApal.me.
Mm-hmm.
So there are quite a lot of resources. As you say, we've got the Wellness Hub, which is all the blogs, different articles about all the different genes. So there is quite a lot of information there. Where you can just see all different aspects of health and just how genes relate in. I think that's a nice resource for people. And then the app is available, not completely worldwide, but definitely in South Africa and a lot of the major countries. And we also ship worldwide. So don't be put off by the fact that the headquarters is in the UK. I'm obviously based in South Africa, so I keep a heap of kits with me. I can courier them anywhere in the country if people want to do them here.
So how does that work? So people then, they purchase a kit from you, then you send the kit to them.
Yes.
What's in the kit?
So it's really simple. It looks like kind of an earbud, like a long earbud, just a swab. It needs 30 seconds inside the cheek on both sides just to get a good, basically we're trying to get the cells from the cheek. Goes into a little envelope. We work with a lab that's based in Denmark, so all the samples go off to Denmark. Those get processed. It is quite a lengthy process, so results can take about 4 to 6 weeks. That obviously includes posting overseas, so it takes quite a while. And then what they'll get from us is emailed reports, so different kind of PDF reports that are created by me. And then they get access to the app. They just need their unique barcode that links their DNA data, and that will pull it into the app. They get asked a set of questions, and once they've answered those, they get all the recommendations and things directly through that.
Then you A for away.
Yeah.
Wonderful. What a pleasure it's been to chat to you, Kate. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Not so fast. And let me level with you. It is such a cool feeling when I see that Spotify subscribers number increase on the weekly, when I see the number of people listening to the episodes going up. And it really makes a huge difference. Have you ever done something and you feel so good when you get rewarded by some positive feedback and you really feel like you're making a difference? That's what it means to me, and that's how I feel. And it goes a long way if you like the show, share it and subscribe it. Thank you humbly, and I'll see you next week.